Thank you for coming out this evening. We couldn't keep you away anyway because it's going to be fun. Before we start, a couple things going on. Well, one, not going on. Wonderful Christmas present. In just a couple days, October, only a couple months away from Christmas. So, as a bookseller, I have to encourage you to buy multiple copies of this book because it's the perfect gift for someone if they don't have it. Also, we've had I don't know what, the reading of the Rhinebeck Star Library is doing a one read for the month of October. The book is called March by Geraldine Brooks. Wonderful historical fiction, not too long, 20% off for another until the first of the month. Okay, so just those commercial announcements out of the way. It's you know, the historical setting that we have in Rhinebeck is you know, it's legendary, and one of the places that maybe 20 years ago wasn't quite so legendary as Wilderstein, when it was a little bit in decay. But over the past decade, a remarkable transformation has taken place there. And I'm going to introduce you to Greg Suckley, the Executive Director of the Wilderstein Historic Site, who we might say is perhaps chiefly responsible for the beautiful restoration there. And he will introduce our speaker. Here's Greg.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you, Dick, for hosting this event here at Oblong tonight, and also thank you all again for coming out and helping us to celebrate the new release of Wilderstein and the Suckleys. Over 10 years ago, Wilderstein Historic Site was incredibly lucky to have had Cynthia Phillip write this wonderful book for us. Cynthia is an independent historian who has written extensively on the Hudson Valley. Her other books include Robert Fulton, a biography, and Rhinecliff, The Tangled Tale of Rhinebeck's Waterfront. Her wide array of articles and essays have appeared also in both local as well as national newspapers and magazines. This second edition is very much a new edition, with a new cover, new color photographs inside the book, a new afterword, a new timeline, and a new index. So even if you already own it, you're going to want to pick up a new copy. Just a couple more quick thank yous before we get started. I want to recognize Stephen Hoare of Black Dome Press for taking on this project and being so wonderful to work with, and also the many people who provided all of the assistance and support along the way that was necessary in order to create both editions of this book, with special thanks going to Wint Aldridge and to Dwayne and Linda Watson. And now, without any further ado, it is my honor to introduce Cynthia Owen Phillip.
Well, it makes me very happy to be surrounded by so many friends of my writing. And I see new faces too, and I hope they'll become friends as well. This evening it is already dark. I hate it. I want to concentrate on Daisy Suckley and her formative years, because they are the ones who really, she is the person who, through her passion for the place, has kept it for us and preserved it so that we can enjoy it and be enlightened by it. And it is a fascinating place, and I have liked it for a long time, and it is in fabulous shape right now, as you see by the cover of the book. It has been painted. When I first went there, it had not been painted since 1912, and there was not any paint left. And you couldn't see the walls because they were covered with soot. But you never paid any attention because that's the way people were in the Hudson River Valley, particularly in this northern part of it, even though not the Vanderbilts and people like that. That was all done up. But people lived in their houses. And that's one of the great magics of Wilderstein. And so I will talk about Daisy's formative years, which are something else again. I was lucky to know her. I knew her. I actually was presented to her when I was first met. Oh, I don't know about it. Is it? Thank you. Is it? I like to stand. I can sit. Hello? Hello? I don't know how they work.
Put a stack of books underneath it or something like that. Get it up higher.
Oh, I think this, maybe it doesn't extend.
Oh, it doesn't. Should I sit then? I'll sit.
You should sit.
All right.
Okay.
Put a stack of books underneath it.
I'm a stander. Well, anyhow. Because I'm short. Oh, this will make me happy. Oh, we can take one out.
Oh, you can stand now.
Many books and then it'll
That'll be good. If you stand, you'll be good.
Oh, I like to stand. I'm afraid to say some people are standers and some people are sitters. And it says it's very good for you to stand now, so I'm happy about it because you see I'm ancient of days. Anyhow, I was very lucky to know Daisy. I met her when I was first married and knew her off and on. And but I really got to know her after we came back from living in Malaysia, and we lived at Rokeby for a couple of summers, and I used to play tennis with her brother Arthur. He was then 74, I think, or something like that, and I always thought that he would fail on the court. Not at all. He stood there. He was uplifting me. He stood there. He could make the ball bounce in absolutely any direction. He never got tired of the sun. He went on in long sets, and there I was panting away and doing the best I could. But they were remarkable people. However, they came about it in the strangest way. Daisy was probably the most complex person I have ever known well. Or I thought I knew her well at that time. I know her better now that I've been thinking about her over the years, really, because I know more about her. One thing was that the papers between her and Franklin Roosevelt had not been found by anybody here. I think Anna Roosevelt was probably the only person who knew that she had them, because she sent them to him. But they were there with her, and later we got an entirely different picture of her, which enlarged it, and enlarged, in fact, thinking about it made me think about my own life, and she was a person who kept going and reinventing herself in so many ways. As an example of her playfulness and her multiple personality, when I was asked to do this, oh, here I stray.
No, I'll just move on.
Well, just keep after me, that's all. I had my hair cut this morning and said, keep your head still. Anyhow, I received 85 letters in a dress box. Now, I'm a person who writes from primary sources, letters, diaries, photographs, bills, anything. But I want it to be immediate and at the time, because I feel that that's the way you get to know the people. I didn't know how I could do it, but she was my friend, and she seemed to want me to do it. And so I took a deep breath, and I said, all right. I didn't say all right to her. I said, oh, yes, I'll do it. And so the Kaplan Fund funded this thing, so I had a lot of impetus behind me. And I said to her, I went in and out, and we kind of talked around. And about a week later, she said, "Why don't you go around the house and see what you can find?" Well, as many of you now know, I found one of the great private collections that I have ever encountered. There are not 85, there are thousands and thousands, and probably thousands Watsons. They're in charge of them. They're very good. We'll talk about them later. And thousands and thousands and thousands of letters beginning in 1792 and going right up to the present day, I expect. And there are also thousands of photographs. And as you will see in the book, every page practically has got a vintage photograph in it. And part of this is because the whole family loved photographs very, very early on. And they had little cameras, and they took pictures, and they kept them. And there they were. And they also had very good people photograph them when it was being done professionally. And they are there. And then there are all of the very large family and so forth. But Daisy knew all those papers were there. She had gone through them herself. I saw her little note marks, not all of them, a few of them, on her on some of them. And I knew that she knew it was there. What she was doing, I realized much later, because I was so enthusiastic about the painting, the pictures, and also the all of the documents, just all of them, all over the place, that I realized suddenly she was doing two things. She was testing me, and she was teasing me. And we never spoke about it because I knew it wasn't, we spoke gently with her. And at least I did. I was a great deal younger than she was. But we got to be very great friends. And Winty Aldrich, who many of you must know, who is the historian of the Hudson River Valley in spades, and he did the books. And we went up in the attic, and just to describe what the house was like at that time, we plugged a plug that was dangling down into an outside socket on the third floor, a very old socket. We trudged up these dark, semi-dark stairs because the cord went up and up and up. It went up to the top of the gable in the attic. It dropped down. It had an old light bulb in it that I would say that at that time the light cord was 50 years old at least. It was covered with spiders and their nests and so forth. It was just why they didn't burn down. This is a wooden house. I mean, the new house was a wooden house, but they didn't. And there they were. There were trunks of things that I think I was the first person to open. There were suitcases. There were, of course, all the books. There were papers in the books, and when he would give them to me, and we had a very gay time up there. But there were also toys. There were bicycles. There was empty luggage. There was all the things of a family life, really. There were also dresses, some of them very grand indeed. There were also patterns for all of the dresses that they had worn, and some of them you can see in the pictures, with little swatches of material to say what they were made of. And they were all lined up very neatly. Other things weren't, but they were. And it was just a whole huge attic, you know how large the house is, filled with the life of a family. And that was very, very exciting to me. Here I am. Well, okay. At any rate, to go back a step, Daisy was born in 18 1891 at Wilderstein. She was the second child to be born there. She had 3 older brothers. She was the first girl, and then she was followed by 2 twins. The house that she was brought up in, just to give you a mise en scène for her love for it, I described in the opening paragraph of this book, and I'll read it to you. Set so high on a bluff above the Hudson River that on a clear day the rift in the headlands 30 miles to the south can be seen from its exuberant 5-story tower, Wilderstein stands a resplendent example of America's Queen Anne style of architecture. It is intricately framed with verandas, decorated gables, and rich period interiors. They capture the playful creativity of the Gilded Age. The walks and gardens laid out by the premier landscape architect Calvert Vaux and his son Downing, together with the gazebos, carriage house, ice house, potting shed, and gate lodge, enveloped Wilderstein in a magical world of its own. This is the world into which Daisy was born. And to go back a step, I will say that when her father and mother were married in 1884, was it? Yes. No, 1882. I sometimes get mixed up. At any rate, they were living in Orange, New Jersey. His father was living at Wilderstein in a plain Italian villa. It was comfortable, it was attractive, the land was marvelous, and it had lots of fruit trees and things on it, but it was built in 1851, and it was where he grew up in, but they had moved to the fashionable suburb of Orange, which was then had lots of Queen Anne houses in it. His brother and sister had died before he did, and his father was getting older, and he was very sad. His wife had also died, and the Garretsons who lived down below had also died, and it had changed hands. And he died. The minute he died, Robert and Bessie began remodeling or transfiguring this plain Italian villa. As you see the picture of it, you know it had the 5-story tower that was added. It was lifted up 3 to 3 stories with this immense peaked attic above it. It had ornate decorations in the Queen Anne style all over the house. It had interiors were done. They went ahead at a great pace. Their architect was Arno Cannon Jr., who came from Poughkeepsie and who had done the Rogers House, which is a medieval castle. Just before this, he had done his the Ellerslie was just built before this. He was a very bright, very able, and very accomplished architect. He also had 2 brothers working for him, and who were construction people. And what is extraordinary is that all these buildings that he built, if you know the carriage house, it's the most magnificent, huge building, were built within 1 year. They went in and they did it. What this means to me is that they had been planning in advance to pop in and do it immediately. They were ready to go. And so forth. At any rate, they did. And it is the place that we see today that they made. They hired Calvert Vaux and his son Downing to do the landscape and had a wonderful time with them because Robert had a very strong technological streak. He lent Downing his new transit, and he was crushing stones. He had a stone crusher that he worked with. He worked around the place in all kinds of ways, but his problem was he never really followed through in a lot of ways. But they had a grand time, and they did, after the house was built and the outbuildings were built, and they built greenhouses, they built gardens, there were walkways, gazebos. What else did he do? I mean, he just kept at it. However, Robert himself took care of guiding the planting. They had gardeners and so forth. This went on apace, and it was a magical, wonderful place, and this is where Daisy spent her first 5 years. In 1897, in 1893, let's go back a step, there was the terrible panic of 1893, from which Robert, who wasn't earning any living, he was living off his fortune, which was many millions of dollars when he began. And he lost a great deal of money, but he was not a good investor. He had lived on an allowance until that time, and his father had also until he inherited from his father. So it was a funny pattern there where they didn't really know how to work and at a consistent job, or even Robert was just not very good at making money. 5 years went by in this enchanting world with fancy racehorses, a herd of cattle, prize cattle, ponies for the children, horses, and pony carts, and everything that you could imagine, and lovely clothes, which you'll see in the picture. And then suddenly he realized he didn't have any money. And he closed up shop. Bingo. He dismissed the servants. He dismissed the groundskeepers. He had 24 groundskeepers. He dismissed them. He packed up the family and moved them to Switzerland. It was an awful shock for the children. They did not know what was happening. It happened overnight. And bingo, they were living, and they would live there. At least Daisy and her sisters would live there for the next 10 years. And it was a formative time for all three of their lives. They went to a place in the Southern Alps called Chateau de. How do you pronounce it?
You say day.
Day, okay. Daisy used to inspect me, but I'm not so good at pronunciation. It's O-E-O-E-O-X, right? And it's pronounced Day, Chateau Day. It was in a fashionable resort, which took no consumptives in their advertising, at least they said. And it was a large one, and they lived a pension living there. Almost immediately, the marriage between Robert and Bessie started to collapse. I'm not sure how good it was from the beginning. Robert played cards, tennis, skated with his other friends, his men friends. He went mountain climbing. He went hiking. The children were more or less left in the hands of Bessie, But Bessie liked only the boys, and she didn't like the girls at all. She then she made that very clear, and she put all but Henry. Henry was the oldest, and he was 12 years old, and he got a proper tutor, and he then went to a boarding school for a year, and then he went to Phillips Exeter, and he went to Harvard, and he succeeded extremely well. He got away from the family, which he needed to do. Bessie, meanwhile, had a mental collapse and started going to sanatoria to get well. One of the people, for instance, that she fell into the hands of was S. Weir Mitchell, a really diabolical man at the end of the century, who insisted that women, particularly he liked to treat, had total bed rest. They ate gruel, baby food. They were not allowed to read. They were not allowed to speak to anybody. They were not to do, everything had to be totally quiet. All sensory perceptions removed from their lives. Well, it's not very good for you. But the object was to make them totally subservient to S. Weir Mitchell. The terrible thing that she did was first take Robin with her because she thought he was delicate. And he had a terrible time. It was even worse for Arthur, who she took with her also later. And they had a perfectly horrible time. I mean, I cannot speak aloud the things that happened to poor Arthur. And it did not stop. It did not stop. Although they eventually did go to the boarding school for a year, and they went back to followed Henry to Exeter and Harvard, but neither of them did very well. They simply were not prepared. They were mentally mixed up. They didn't know what they were doing. They came home from school. Meanwhile, Daisy and the girls were left on their own. Bessie did not like to keep house. She liked the dancing. When she was out of her sanatoria, she liked to buy clothes. She liked to dance. She liked to go around more and more. She and Robert didn't go together. They went separately. And meanwhile, and Daisy was made the guardian of her younger sisters. She took it on her shoulders. Perhaps they were lucky because they didn't go to the sanatoria. Nobody cared whether they were well or not. Bessie cared only for her boys and made it very, very clear. They had no education until they were 15 years old, except from Daisy was 15, the twins were 13, except a haphazard nurse governesses. They had no institutional education. Bit by bit, the family went home to go to, when the boys went to school, Bessie wanted to accompany them so that she could see that they got proper food at their schools. They'd interfere with their lodging. She would interfere with the headmaster. She would have a doctor come in and take their temperature. It was really very hard for them. As I said, Henry was the only one who really escaped this because he was not there that long, and he was able to shield himself from it. And he was, but Arthur and Robin had a very hard time. So meanwhile, I think about Daisy in this fancy pension. One thinks of Eloise, written large and broad and deep, much more serious than that. I think of how she was there, with no proper home, and having come from this wonderful place, which I must say was cozy as well as being magnificent. And she had was living in rented quarters, basically, and eating her meals at a dining room table with lots of other people. And it was very gay for the adults who were there. So I always have imagined her as sitting there and figuring out how adults behaved at a very young age and how to play act with people at a very young age, how to get along with people who came and went, people who, and all the time she was thinking of Wilderstein, and as her father and mother went back to Wilderstein and the boys went back, she was left by herself with the two twins in Switzerland. So she had, in a sense, I wonder if she wasn't luckier than the boys, because she at least wasn't sent to these terrible sanitarium, except for Henry. And the other thing that I think about her is, I wonder what she did when she wasn't looking at all the grown-ups, but, you know, behaving and misbehaving and doing the things that grown-ups do, which they do when they go into pleasure hotels. I wonder what books she read. I don't know. That's not in her correspondence. It's not in her thing. Her correspondence really at quite a young age is cheerful, but I think that that was the persona she put on. On the other hand, I think she was very fortunate to be a cheerful, optimistic personality, and I think that she also made good with what was at hand, because when she did, in the last year she was there, go to she went to two different pensions. She went to a good one, and then her mother thought that she shouldn't be there, so she sent one that was nice for quiet girls like the twins. I don't think they were quiet at all. They had a lot of fun, but they were not students. But Daisy was very, very smart, and she was just natively extremely intelligent. So I imagine that she must have read a great deal. And because she got, at any rate, finally, in 1907, Robert decided the family couldn't go on the way it was and brought them home. The house was beginning to deteriorate, but the kids had a good time. There were they had cousins surrounding them. She had a big family in New York that they would visit. They had all of the young people up here. They played tennis. They were good at sports. They played tennis. They danced. They had dances, private dances in the houses, and they ran around with motor cars. There was one great unifying thing in that family. One is they all loved motor cars, including Bessie. Bessie was driven by a chauffeur, of course, but all of the children got to be fabulous drivers and very, very proud of their driving. And it was just part of the way they did things. They also were great photographers, which is why there are so many wonderful photographers here. And to Robert's credit, he had a little place where he developed films on the the second floor of the house by his bedroom, where he would develop his own pictures. And he did that he took remarkable pictures, which you will see in this book at a very, very early time. And all the children, the other thing that united them is that all the children were musical. And so was Robert. And they did play together, and they did this play on their instruments together, and they enjoyed concerts together. And I remember when, just to show you how much Daisy was very fond of her father, but she never did very much with him. He was always off by himself and with his men friends and so forth. But she was very, what was I going to say? Where was I? I lost my track. I went ahead.
Musical.
Hmm?
They were musical.
Huh?
They were musical.
Oh, they were musical. One of the last things I heard, I was in the house, and I heard somebody playing the piano, and I thought that it was Mrs. Smiley from across the river, because she used to come and play at Christmas for Christmas carols and so forth. And it wasn't. It was Daisy, remembering her father and remembering playing together. And she played pretty well. They all did, because they all had lessons and it was important to them. This held the family together. However, things deteriorated and deteriorated, and the girls were sent away to school, I guess as much to get them away as anything, but Daisy was always sent to a school that was suitable for her younger sisters who were not as intellectual as she was. At one time, she persuaded the family that she should go to Bryn Mawr, and she did, but her family said that her mother said that she should stay only 2 years, and back she came in 2 years. War came along and did other things to the family. First of all, Henry, who was anxious to get out of the country, applied for the American Ambulance Corps as soon as war broke out, and went to France, and went first to the Western Front and then to the Eastern Front. A little bit later, Arthur went. When we went to war, Arthur went to the Ambulance Corps and did very important things in the having to do with refugees and so forth, and he loved it in Paris. And in fact, he left the United States, not completely, because he would come back from time to time, but he built a house in Monte Carlo, and that is where he spent most of the rest of his life. And he was very clever about it. In fact, he built a tower that had he had two apartments in it, one for him and one he could rent. My mother-in-law once, when her husband died, my father-in-law died, rented it with her sister one summer. And so that this is, so he got away. And Henry was away already. Robin was a really very good musician and was in a military band. Bessie took everybody down to where he was in training in North Carolina, and he took Betty down and took Daisy down, and Catherine had gone her own way already, but they all did war work and so forth, but they went down there, and where Bessie entertained the troops and their friends, and Betty got married. And she is the only person in the family who did get married, which was more typical of that time than we can remember. But I think only her father got married. Robert's father got married in the family, and in a large family, but not as large as Bessie and Robert's. At any rate, they had a good time. Daisy there had a very, very heavy boyfriend. And in fact, on their way back north, she stopped in Washington to see him secretly. Who knows what would have happened? Timing was simply bad, but she became the godson of his first son, godmother of his first son. So it was this long, long-term relationship. Life went on, and her father died in 1921, full of gout and so forth. But apparently, Daisy and Catherine, who lived a sophisticated life, were at that time, and probably before that time, being a passe-partout with a girlfriend, who was one of Daisy's Bryn Mawr classmates. Anyhow, he died, the next year, her life was transformed because Sarah Roosevelt called her up and asked her if she would sit by Franklin's pool, Vincent Astor's pool, while Franklin Roosevelt, just out of bed from polio, was trying to strengthen his legs. And that was the beginning of the famous closest relationship, which was great fun. It was as if her whole life was a preparation for it, because she brought to it all the sophistication, all the flirtations she'd seen, all the knowledge that she had picked up along the way, and also play acting. And when you think of those two, you think that Franklin had a wonderful childhood. He did not have a lonely little childhood, which some people talk about. He was surrounded by family and friends. He rode his bicycle by himself from down to Newburgh to see his grandfather from Hyde Park, crossing on a ferry all by himself. And he was roaming over the hills with the Rogers boys and with the and girls and with the Newbolls who lived next door. He had a very gay and wonderful life. He went to Harvard and did very well there and was very much a big person. And he married Eleanor, who was very well suited for him. Don't think for a minute she wasn't. And, but he then got polio, and he, of course, he broke, I mean, there was a lot of things happened in Eleanor and Franklin's life, which I'm not going to go into right now, but I know about them. And, but in 1921, just after her father died, she became the closest companion of Franklin Roosevelt. And he had been an active person and suddenly had to be carried out of bed to do everything, to do anything. He couldn't stand up. He never could stand up by himself, even with his braces. My mother-in-law and father-in-law knew him very well, and my father-in-law was one of the people who got him to run for governor. But in the campaign for the presidential campaign, she was very clever with advertising, and she said, Franklin, she said, I want to prepare shoes in a department store, and I'm going to put a sign over it that says, who will fill his shoes for the governorship? And he said, Helen, they weigh 80 pounds. And she really didn't realize it because he was such a good play actor. And they both were, and they had more fun than you can believe, play acting with each other, being very intimate on the inside. Daisy was always telling him, be careful, be careful. And she, on the outside, would play the naive person, or she got tired of somebody who said, who are you? She said, oh, I work for the president. And their eyes would glaze over, and then she'd go around a big, long circle that went on, and then they suddenly realized, that's not quite right, she's something else. I mean, being a relative. She passed herself as a relative in this way. But this was her persona. And it worked. And they had a perfectly marvelous time. She's the one of, I think there are 2 photographs of him in a wheelchair, and she took one of them. He also took a photograph of her on a tiger rug, which came from his grandfather's house, which he had in his office at the White House. Very glamorous. Anyhow, they had a good time. I will now step forward to the present, more or less present day, and that is Wilderstein. Oh, I know, first of all, no, I forgot. These poor boys, and Bessie died when she was 89 years old after all the sickness. Catherine died young. She was only 70, and somehow she was separated from the family. I knew that I should never mention it. I don't know what happened. I would like to know, and I'm sure it's knowable. It just have to go to the papers. Robin was 86 years old when he died. Arthur was 85, and I tell you, he was out there swatting that ball like everything. Anyhow, but in 1983, Daisy realized that only she and Betty were left. And she put, with the help of Windy Aldrich, Wilderstein into Wilderstein Preservation. What she put in was the house and the grounds to begin with. And she had life occupancy. That it began slowly, and then I came in, and Dwayne and Linda Watson came in to do the manuscripts with great background in that from the public library, and couldn't be better. They're still doing it, and I think if you are Egyptian cats that you'll have to live more than 9 lives to finish it, because there is so many thousands of them. And they were just great help with finding what I needed for what I was doing. The other person was Anne Lillajoel, who I don't know whether she's here tonight or not, but she was asked to do the photographs. And she was a person who had been trained to do archival photographs, and that's why, and she and I chose these for the book, and we had a glorious time with each other. Since then, after the slow beginning, Wilderstein Preservation has gone forward step by step by step, and it is now galloping along, I am glad to say. It is stunning. It is as it was inside before it deteriorated for how many years. I can remember going into that house before they got to doing the restoration, and water was coming over the front door in sheets. Daisy spat out to the pantry, got her pots and pans, put them out. I went home, I found a little leak in my room ceiling. I crawled over and said, Daisy, we got the same problem. But she had a torrent coming in there. You couldn't see the walls. They were so covered with everything. But bit by bit, they have restored it in its original splendor. It is simply marvelous. And so that you see the house today that you would see before. And you see, and they've also done the immediate outbuildings. And more than that, they have a plan to do this absolutely magnificent combination stable, carriage house and cow barn that was built in 4 months, actually. Can't believe it, but it was. And, but was in terrible need of restoration because it had just was filled with water, and there were all kinds of treasures that just did disappear at that time because they just rotted away. But it is, they're working on that now, and they've got it all shored up, and they have a long-term plan, and that's the way you do these things. It takes a long time to do it. But I'm so happy myself to have been a part of it, to have known so many. I met Robin only once, so I can't say I knew him, but I knew Arthur and Daisy very well. And Betty, of course, because she was 96 when she died. And Daisy, we know, was in her 100th year. There are 2 things I would like to finish with from her book. One, she wrote to Franklin, and we did not know about it because nobody, even Wendy Aldrich, did not know about those letters. There she is as an old woman, straight as an arrow. Somebody said, you know, she always reminded me of a dancer. And they all were great dancers, too, by the way. And, but here, let me see, I had it marked in my book, which I left at home. But I know where it is. It's on page, that's acknowledgments. 125. And then I go. Oh, I forgot one little thing that I should tell you, and that is Daisy worked for her aunt as a companion and a secretary, and she lived at she lived at Mansakenning, and she did not live at Wilderstein. She couldn't get there, but Franklin was always finding ways. It was during this period for her to get there, and she did from time to time, but she didn't get it. Now wait a minute. And I will also say, I forgot to say, is that Arthur was always giving her good advice to sell the place and get a place of her own. And at the end, he said, you know, once you get an establishment your own, you will never want to leave it. Well, he knew she wouldn't take it. She just gave that advice. And let me see. Oh, here it is. It's 120. It's 120. This is what she wrote to Franklin once, and this tells her of. This gives the depth of her feeling for Wilderstein. She wrote Franklin of her situation at Aunt Sophie's. This is when she was not living at Wilderstein. It is strange to be living in someone else's house. The wind in the trees even is a strange wind, whereas there is an intimacy with the wind that sighs through the branches of the pines outside my tower window at home. No matter how often you've heard them, they are always strangers compared to the creakings and sunlight at home. I mean, isn't that wonderful? And just before she died, in the years before, couple of years before she died, I want to quote this last thing. Oops, it's here. A local in 1989, a local carpenter was hired to repair the decayed sashes of Wilderstein's tower. He, who's Reed Bielenberg, for those of you who know him. Now I've lost my place again. Oh, here it is. And he and Daisy became friends. After one afternoon, she climbed the steep stairs to the top of the top floor. This is almost, she's 98. Steep stairs to the top floor to see how the work was progressing. This is my favorite place in the whole house, she told him. When I was a little girl, I asked my mother where I came from. She answered that I came through a top tower window on a sunbeam. One of these days, she continued, I shall go out on a moonbeam. And I believe that she's up there looking down at all of us saying, hooray! And the other last thing I want to tell you is one of the best things about Daisy. She loved new friends all her life. And she once said to me, you know, sometimes you like new friends better than old ones. And she had this great gift. And so that I hope that you like this book because, and you think about it, because she was very complex. She was a role player. She was, and she had this, and if you've never had a relationship with somebody of the opposite sex, as she did with Franklin, and I don't happen to believe it was sexual because there were consequences in those days, which even I remember. And and also he was not that active in those days, as we know. He already had polio. But the thing is that it was one of those perfect relationships, and they felt totally trusting with each other. And wasn't she lucky? She kept it in her heart. as well as the place all her life. Thank you.